She called me the pipe man, not to my face. She whispered it to her mother loud enough for me to hear, loud enough for the two women beside her to laugh. I was standing maybe 4 feet away, holding a bottle of Shiraz I'd brought as a gift, still wearing my good jacket. The charcoal one I'd bought at Moore's in Sudbury for my retirement dinner 3 years ago. And Meredith Ashworth looked at me, this woman who was about to become my son's mother-in-law. And she whispered it like I was furniture. Like I couldn't hear. Like it didn't matter if I could, the pipe man. I set the wine down on the hall table. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. And then my son Callum was at my elbow, his hand on my arm, his voice quiet and close. And he said, "Dad, not yet, please, just stay." I didn't know what not yet meant, but I knew that tone. I'd heard it when he was 9 years old, and his hockey team was down by 3 goals in the third period, and he'd looked at his teammates and said the same thing. Not yet. He'd meant it then. He meant it now. So I stayed. I should back up. Because none of this makes sense without understanding where I come from, and where my son Callum comes from, and what kind of people the Ashworths turned out to be. My name is Gerald Kowalczyk. I am 64 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the son of a Polish immigrant who worked the nickel mines for 31 years. My father's hands were the roughest things I've ever touched in my life. Skin like bark, knuckles swollen from the cold and the work. He used to say, in his broken English with the accent he never quite lost, "Gerald, a man is worth what his hands have done." I thought about that a lot growing up. I still think about it now. I became a plumber. Not because I fell into it, because I chose it. I apprenticed at 17, got my red seal at 22, started my own company at 31. Kowalczyk Plumbing and Mechanical. We did residential, commercial, some light industrial. At our peak I had 11 trucks on the road and 23 employees. When the big subdivision went up east of Sudbury in the late 90s, 1,600 homes over 8 years, my company did the rough-in for every single one of them. I am not a rich man by Bay Street standards, but I built a life, a real one. My wife Susan died when Callum was 16. Ovarian cancer diagnosed in March, gone by November. 8 months. That's all we had from the diagnosis to the end. And for most of that time she was still trying to make Callum's school's lunches and asking me how my day went. She was that kind of woman. The kind that faces something terrible and keeps facing forward. After she passed, it was just Callum and me in the house on Larch Street. We ate a lot of bad pasta that first year. We watched a lot of hockey. We argued sometimes about nothing, about whose turn it was to shovel the walk, about whether he was studying enough, about small, stupid things that were really about the big thing neither of us knew how to talk about. But we got through it. And somewhere in that getting through, my son became the best person I know. He's 31 now. He works in environmental consulting, water systems assessment, primarily for First Nations communities across northern Ontario. He drives a lot of long, empty roads. He cares deeply about what he does. He got his mother's stubbornness and I like to think at least a little of my ability to read a situation before it goes sideways. He met Tiffany Ashworth at a conference in Toronto 2 years ago. She's a project manager at an engineering firm. Smart woman, genuinely. Organized, sharp, good at her job. I liked her when I first met her. I want to be clear about that, because what happened later wasn't really about Tiffany. Not directly. It was about her parents. Douglas and Meredith Ashworth live in a house in Oakville that backs onto the lake. 4 bedrooms, a finished walkout basement, a stone patio with a built-in natural gas fireplace. Douglas is a semi-retired financial advisor. Mutual funds, wealth management. The kind of practice that runs itself once you've built the client base. Meredith doesn't work, or hasn't for many years. She volunteers on a hospital foundation board, sits on a condo corporation committee in Florida where they winter. They drive a Lexus and a Volvo. They belong to a golf club. I don't say any of this with bitterness. People make their lives. These were the lives they made. The first time I met them was at a dinner in Oakville about 8 months after Callum and Tiffany started dating. It went fine. Polite. Douglas asked me vague questions about the trades that made it clear he didn't know much about them and wasn't particularly curious to learn. Meredith was warm in a careful way. The way you're warm to someone when you've already decided what box they go in, but you haven't finished decorating the lid yet. I drove home that night and didn't think much of it. The second time, Callum mentioned afterward that Douglas had asked him, in a private moment, whether he was thinking about his future. Callum had looked at him and said he was 30 years old with a master's degree and a career he loved, and that seemed like a future to him. Douglas had laughed it off, called it just small talk. Small talk tells you everything. By the time the engagement happened, Callum proposed on a camping trip near Lake Temagami, just the two of them, a ring that had belonged to his mother. I had a feeling in my chest that I couldn't name exactly. Not dread, something quieter than that, a kind of waiting. The engagement dinner was Meredith's idea and Meredith's production. 40 people, their house in Oakville. catered by a company out of Burlington. Those little past appetizers on slate boards, the kind of food that looks like art and disappears in one bite. Flowers everywhere. A playlist of soft jazz that floated through the main floor like it was trying not to disturb anyone. I drove down from Sudbury that morning, 4 hours. I wore the charcoal jacket and a tie that Callum had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Navy, small pattern, good quality. I stopped at the LCBO in Mississauga and picked up a bottle of Shiraz. I wasn't nervous exactly, I was just myself, which I've learned over 64 years is either an asset or a liability depending on the room. I arrived a little early. Meredith answered the door. She looked at me, a quick, full look, the kind you give someone when you're measuring them, and said, "Gerald, you made it wonderful." Then she turned back to something in the kitchen. The house was already filling up with people I didn't know. Tiffany's extended family, their friends, colleagues of Douglas's from his years in finance. Everyone was dressed well. Most of the men were wearing blazers. I found a corner near the fireplace and stood there for a few minutes, holding my wine and taking it all in. That's when I heard it. Meredith was talking to her sister, a woman named Patricia who I'd met briefly once before, and Patricia had asked, apparently, who I was. And Meredith leaned in, wine glass tilted, and said, "Oh, that's Douglas's pipe man. Well, Callum's father. He's a plumber from up north somewhere." And then she laughed. And Patricia laughed. And the woman standing beside them laughed. I stood very still. There's a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't arrive hot. It arrives cold. It arrives like stepping onto ice you didn't see, that sliding, lurching moment before you catch yourself. That's what it felt like. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about 23 employees and 1,600 homes. I thought about driving 4 hours with a bottle of wine and a tie my son picked out. I thought about a lot of things very quickly. And then I thought, I'm going to leave. I set the wine on the hall table. I started toward the door, hand on my arm, voice low. "Dad, not yet, please, just stay." I looked at him. His face was calm, but his eyes were doing something else, something careful like a man watching a clock. "Callum," I said. "Did you hear what I know," he said. "I know, Dad. Just give me tonight. That's all I'm asking. I'm going to be honest with you. My first instinct was to walk out anyway. I've never been a man who stays in rooms where I'm not wanted. I spent 40 years working alongside people who judge a man by his work, not his address, and I never had much patience for the other kind. But this was my son. And there was something in the way he said, 'Give me tonight,' that made me think he knew something I didn't. So I took a breath. I went back to the corner near the fireplace. I accepted a glass of wine from a passing server. I smiled at people when they spoke to me. I told Douglas's golf friend that yes, winters in Sudbury are something else. I ate things from slate boards and I did not leave. The dinner itself was a long table in the dining room, 14 across. I was seated at the far end from Douglas and Meredith, between two of Tiffany's cousins who were perfectly pleasant and had no idea who I was. Callum was near the middle of the table, across from Tiffany. I watched him throughout the meal. He was easy, relaxed, smiling, but every so often he'd glance at something on his phone under the table, and his jaw would tighten just slightly, and then he'd smile again. After the main course, Douglas stood and gave a toast. It was a good toast, actually, warm about his daughter, generous about Callum. He said they were gaining a son. He mentioned Callum's work, called it important, meaningful work in our natural environment. He did not mention me at all. I didn't expect him to, I'm just noting it. Then Callum stood, the room quieted. People love it when the groom-to-be speaks. There's always something a little electric about it. "I want to start," Callum said, "by talking about the person who taught me everything I know about what it means to be a man." He looked at me. My dad grew up in Sudbury. His father worked the mines. My dad became a plumber, built a company from nothing, put 23 people to work, built homes that people are still living in. And when my mother got sick and then when she passed, he raised me alone. He drove me to hockey at 5 in the morning. He helped me with university applications even though he'd never been to university himself. He sat with me through things I'm not going to talk about here because some things belong just to the two of us. The room was quiet. My dad showed up tonight in his best jacket with a bottle of wine. And I know that some people in this room tonight looked at him and saw a plumber from up north. I need you to know, you were looking at the best man I've ever met. I heard Meredith shift in her chair. I didn't look at her. And I also need to tell you something else, Callum said. His voice didn't change. It stayed even, calm. Because there's a reason I asked Dad to stay tonight. There's something this family deserves to know before Tiffany and I go any further. Tiffany looked up at him. Something crossed her face, surprise maybe, or the beginning of it. Callum set his phone on the table. He'd connected it to something, because a moment later the screen of the television at the end of the dining room, the one Meredith used to show photos at Christmas, probably, came on. 8 months ago, Callum said, I discovered that Douglas Ashworth's company managed a private investment fund that included 17 clients from the Sudbury area. Retirees, mostly. Some of them former tradespeople, some of them people who knew my father. The room had gone completely still. Over a 4-year period, approximately $2.3 million was moved from that fund into a holding company registered in Alberta. The fund's clients were told their investments had underperformed due to market conditions. Some of them lost their retirement savings. One of them was my father's former foreman, a man who worked beside my grandfather in the mines. He's 71 years old and he's back working part-time at Home Hardware in Chelmsford because he needs the income. Douglas stood up. Now just a minute. I have everything documented, Callum said, still calm, still even. Account records, transfer records, correspondence. I've been working with a securities lawyer in Toronto for the past 6 months. The documentation was submitted to the Ontario Securities Commission 11 days ago. I received confirmation of receipt and preliminary review this week. The room was, I don't know how to describe it. It was the sound of people trying to understand what they were hearing while simultaneously understanding it perfectly. I'm not doing this to hurt Tiffany, Callum said, and he looked at her then, directly at her, with something that I think was a kind of love even in that moment. I'm doing it because I couldn't marry into a family where this was happening and say nothing. Because my dad taught me that a man doesn't walk past something wrong just because it's inconvenient to stop. He picked up his glass. Congratulations to everyone, he said quietly. The food has been excellent, and he sat down. What happened next happened fast and slow at the same time, the way things do when something enormous comes apart in a room full of people. Douglas came around the table. He was not loud, but he was very intense, his voice low and tight, leaning toward Callum, saying things I couldn't hear from where I was sitting. 2 of his golf friends stood up. Meredith had her hand over her mouth. Patricia, the sister, was looking at her phone. Tiffany didn't move for a long moment. She sat very still, looking at the table. Then she looked at Callum, and what passed between them I will never be able to fully describe because I was watching from a distance and some things aren't mine to know. She shook her head, slowly, once. Then she stood up and went upstairs. People began leaving. Not all at once, but steadily the way water drains. Within 40 minutes, the house was mostly empty. The catering staff were quietly clearing the table, working around people who stood in clusters speaking in low voices. I was still in my chair at the end of the table, when Callum came and sat beside me. We didn't say anything for a minute. You've been sitting on that for 6 months, I finally said. 8 months, he said. Since March. You came to Sudbury in March, I said. You stayed for a week and helped me rebuild the back deck. Yeah, he said, and you were already sitting on this. I needed to be sure, he said. I needed the lawyer to be sure. I needed the documentation to be complete before I did anything. I looked at my hands on the table. Meredith called me the pipe man tonight, when she didn't know I could hear. Callum was quiet for a moment. I knows, he said. I've heard things. Over the past 2 years I've heard a lot of things. And tonight you chose. I chose you, he said, simply. I chose you, and I chose those 17 people who lost their savings. That's what I chose. I don't cry easily. I'm a 64-year-old man from Sudbury, and I was raised by a Polish miner. And none of that lends itself to crying in the dining rooms of people you don't much care for. But I will tell you that I came very close in that moment. In the weeks that followed, the Ontario Securities Commission investigation moved forward. Douglas Ashworth hired lawyers, good ones, expensive ones, the kind that Oakville can afford. But the documentation Callum had compiled was thorough. His lawyer, a woman named Andrea Fonseca, who had 20 years in securities litigation, told us later that it was one of the most complete pre-filing packages she had ever received from a private individual. The case took 14 months to fully resolve. Douglas was found to have committed fraud under the Ontario Securities Act. He was ordered to repay the misappropriated funds with interest, a figure that by the time legal costs and penalties were factored in, came to just over $3.1 million. The Oakville house was sold. The Volvo went. The golf club membership was quietly discontinued. Douglas also received a lifetime ban from acting as a registrant in the securities industry in Canada, and a referral to the Crown for criminal fraud proceedings, which, as of the time I'm telling you this, are still ongoing. Meredith moved into a condo in Burlington. Patricia stopped returning her calls, according to what Tiffany told Callum in one of their few conversations after everything fell apart. Tiffany herself had a harder road. She'd had no knowledge of her father's activities, and that was eventually established clearly. But the engagement was over. She and Callum ended things quietly, without ugliness, in the early weeks after the dinner. She sent me a card. A real card, handwritten. It said that she was sorry for the way her parents had treated me, and that she was proud of Callum for doing what he did, even though it had cost both of them something real. I still have that card. I keep it in the drawer in my kitchen beside the good pens. The man Callum had mentioned, my father's former foreman, a man named Vince Thibodeau, who'd worked beside my father for close to 20 years before my dad passed, received full restitution from the settlement. $94,000 plus interest. I know because Callum told me, and because Vince himself called me one evening from Chelmsford. He didn't say much. He's not a man of many words. He said, "Your boy did something good, Gerald. Your father would have been proud of him." I stood in my kitchen in Sudbury for a long time after I hung up. I looked out at the backyard, at the deck Callum and I had rebuilt together in March, the month he came home and sat with what he knew and said nothing yet, just handed me boards and held the level while I drilled. My father used to say a man is worth what his hands have done. I believe that. I still believe that. But I think I'd add something now. I think I'd say, a man is also worth what he refuses to walk past, what he stops for, what he stays for even when leaving would be easier. My son Callum stayed for me in that dining room in Oakville when I was ready to walk out the door, and I stayed for him when he asked me to. That's the whole thing, really. That's the whole story. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. 4 hours north, up through Barrie, up through the Shield, the Rock and the Pines coming in on both sides of the highway, until you feel like you're going somewhere real. I put on the CBC. I stopped for coffee in Perry Sound. When I pulled into the driveway on Larch Street, I sat in the truck for a minute and looked at the house. The house I bought with Susan. The house Callum grew up in. The deck we'd just rebuilt. The wood still bright and clean. A man's hands. What they've done. What they've built. What they held on to. Meredith Ashworth called me the pipe man and laughed in her own hallway. I think about that sometimes. And then I think about Vince Thibodeau going back to work at Home Hardware. And I think about those 17 people getting their money back. And I think about my son standing at that table with his voice absolutely steady. And I find I don't much mind what Meredith Ashworth called me. Not one bit. If you're watching this and there's someone in your life who looks at what you do, what you've spent your years doing, and treats it like it's less than what they do, I want to ask you something. How long have you been making yourself smaller in their presence? How long have you been setting the wine down quietly and finding a corner? Because sometimes staying isn't the same as accepting. Sometimes staying means you're waiting, watching the clock, like my son was. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the man everyone already dismissed.